Morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to another episode of Conversations in Practical Theology. My name is Saiyyidah Zaidi, and I'm a student of the Doctorate in Practical Theology at Glasgow University, and I'm joined here by Eric Stoddart.
Hello, yes, I'm Eric Stoddart and I teach Practical Theology at University of St Andrews in Scotland.
And a very brief introduction of how we met, because if you didn't listen to the previous episode, you might be curious as to why and how we've come together. But there was a conference on practical theology in the UK last year, and we started to have conversations about certain things that had come up during that discussion, and kind of decided that it would be interesting to continue our discussions and to try and understand and unpack the world of practical theology a little bit more, and then to share these conversations with you. And so today we're looking at well-being, and well-being is a really interesting subject because it covers so many different aspects of life. And from a religious perspective, from a kind of practical perspective, from a secular perspective as well. But I think one of the really kind of interesting things that we can touch on is, where does religion kind of fall into the whole concept of well-being, and how can we actually use faith to aid us in improving our physical, mental, spiritual, all other different kinds of well-being as well. So that's what we're going to try and touch on in this conversation today. And one of the things that I would like to begin with is the whole idea of well-being being part of actually looking after your physical body. And I think as a Muslim, one of the things that I've been taught to do, and I try and practice regularly, is the whole idea of making sure that, you know, you eat well and that you kind of drink properly and you nourish and sustain your body, because in many ways your body is a vessel for the soul. But I think on a kind of practical level, day-to-day life, you know, that gets lost. And I think it's very sad that we've become so connected to certain rituals within our faiths, and then so disconnected with certain teachings within our faith. So let's kind of maybe try and use that as an opener.
Yeah, and you know, in the Christian tradition, we use the language of the body as a temple of the Holy Spirit. And therefore, Christians ought to be looking after their physical bodies, let alone spiritual bodies. So, you know, we share a lot there. And, you know, I'm just thinking, oh, goodness me, I don't get near that. So, you know, hands up to you and to the audience that I'm not going to talk around this as an expert in well-being. It's more about this is one of the areas that certainly my Christian faith, well, maybe doesn't make a huge amount of difference. I don't know, but let's see. So you talked about looking after your body. In what sort of practical steps are encouraged within Islam?
Well, there's a really fascinating hadith, which actually has kind of, and a hadith is a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, which has been documented, so it can kind of like be traced back to him through certain narrations. And the hadith says, take benefit of 5 before 5, your youth before your old age, your health before your sickness, your wealth before your poverty, your free time before you're preoccupied, and your life before your death. And that's something that has actually influenced a lot of my work. And when I kind of discovered this saying and started to unpack how I could live my life by it, I then realized that actually it's one of the hardest things to do, because we as humans set our standards so high, and yet I think sometimes we miss it so much. And so I can say, as in an ideal world, what I would try and do, and interestingly, the Quran, when it defines the type of food that we should be eating, there's so much focus on the word halal, which has become technical in terms of how meat is slaughtered and things like this. What's forgotten is the second part of that, which is an tayyib, and that means and good. And the way that the kind of phrase halal and tayyib has been kind of unpacked, let's say, by the scholars, is that the food should be nourishing, it should be grown well, the animals should be cared for, etc. So, for example, when we look at the milk that's available in the supermarket today, and they say that some milk contains up to 40-50% of mucus, right? Is that really meeting the definition of halal and tayyib? And the problem that we have is that one can aspire to live in a certain way, but practically it's become so much more difficult. And so that then kind of makes you think, well, do I buy cow's milk or do I go on to soya or almond milk? Because actually that's probably more nutritious for me. So these are the kind of day-to-day dilemmas that I'm facing. And just something else to throw in there. I remember once when I was on maternity leave, and I thought, okay, I'm going to buy British. I'm only going to buy British fruit and veg and meat and everything else. So you go to the supermarkets and you're trying to buy tomatoes that have been grown in the UK. And they had been from all over Europe, but I could not find tomatoes that were from Britain. So in the end, you kind of think, okay, I've been to 3 supermarkets now, and you end up buying tomatoes from Spain because that's all that's available. Is that because they weren't in season, or is that because it's cheaper to get them imported? And whilst these questions actually may not necessarily be religion specific, I think that we have a moral obligation to think about the source of our food and our nutrition and all of these other things, because that does then also kind of influence. And here's an interesting thing. So if we're buying our food from abroad, are we looking after our neighbours? And there's another kind of saying which says that we have a responsibility to make sure that we look after our neighbours. That's people within our locality. So if I can buy from a farm shop, that's much better for me than buying from someone who's kind of imported their goods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's because we're facing such a long food chain in the way that our predecessors simply didn't have. Yeah. And you could go to the local farmer and you would buy things. And, you know, whether it's in the time of the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, they were making a short walk to a market. Maybe some spices might have travelled a long distance, but that was it. You had that short connection between the well-being of the animals and the food that you were eating. And, you know, certainly from the Hebrew Bible tradition, where caring for the animals is an important element of being a good person. It doesn't come up overtly, I don't think, in the New Testament, but it is about caring for creation. So sort of by implication, if we're being righteous and attending to God's creation, then we're going to look after animals. We're not going to be dealing with them in ways that are intrinsically harmful for them, which isn't getting to vegetarianism, but it's at that point of saying, you know, how we treat, if animals in some sense are weaker than us, how we treat them actually tells us about our values and who we are before God and how important we understand God's creation.
But isn't it interesting that, you know, in the religious traditions, meat was consumed so much less than it is now. Now there seems to be an expectation of meat for breakfast, lunch and dinner, whereas, you know, what's been documented of the Prophet Muhammad, for example, peace and blessings upon him, is that he would eat like meat maybe once a year, and that would be at kind of a celebration for Eid or something. Now, if I say that to any Muslim or the majority of Muslims, they're going to freak out and they're going to be like, you know, you're talking rubbish. It's so easily accessible now. But people aren't thinking about the source. And I would much rather actually go along the line of becoming a vegetarian and do it with the deliberate kind of intention that it's a tradition of the Prophet that I'm following, because when I eat meat, I want to eat good meat that's wholesome and has been raised properly, and it's something that it's okay. I can do without it on a regular basis. But then that's just me, and I know, you know, it can be quite hard to adjust to becoming a vegetarian. So
yeah, and I think within my tradition, meat has certainly been often so much associated with celebration and feasting. So it's on the feast days, and again, I think it depends on your context. I was at Burns Supper last night, out of season with Burns night. But, and we had haggis there, and that was the leftovers that the people right at the bottom of the economic heap were eating. So haggis was not something that the wealthy people would have lowered themselves to have. And we've flipped it entirely now. But it was salutary to think that, here my predecessors were really struggling in Scotland to find healthy food, certainly if you were at the bottom of the economic pile. And, Burns as a poet taps into some of that about ordinary life and just how difficult it can be. And for me, there's something there about the economics of food and well-being, because if it costs us more money to actually eat healthily, what is that in our society? If it's going to be cheaper to buy food that is actually detrimental to your health, but you can't actually afford either to pay the prices in the specialist shops or to actually travel to the specialist shops. You can't afford a bus fare to get to the farmer's market, even if you could save up for that. So there's a huge, I think, wider political issue about how we enable others' well-being.
I do think some of it comes down to education, though, because I think, I mean, I agree with what you're saying in terms of the quality of, so farmers markets, for example, but actually, let's say you can't go to farmers markets, but you could afford to buy the fruits and veggies and whatever in a supermarket like Lidl or Aldi, and they have so many great offers on these days that if you know how to cook these things, actually you can have a very good, nutritious, healthy diet. But the challenge is that these days, some kids don't even know that potatoes make chips. They think that chips are somehow created from... And I remember being in a supermarket once, and there was a confusion at the checkout till for this item, or for this vegetable. And the lady didn't know what it was, and it took 10 minutes to work out that it was a courgette. And I just stood back, being completely entertained by this, thinking, what has happened in society where a young adult doesn't even know what a courgette is?
Yeah, I wonder if it's not just about education. I think it's so tied up with mental health and self-image that if I'm feeling positive about myself, I will go and cook properly. But if I'm fragile, if I'm needing some comfort food, I will grab unhealthy stuff, shove it in the microwave. And I understand the difference between feeling in a good place and therefore cooking, and feeling in a bad place and eating poorly. And if you're having to weigh that up in terms of just how much money have I got, how many kids am I going to have to manage and feed, I think it's more than education. It's about what has happened to people, where it's tied to mental health, as I say, self-image. It's tied to wider messages that the rest of society put out, and that sort of mixes well-being with health, and how people who are not looking after themselves, in inverted commas, are presented in the press. If you get all those negative messages, I understand why taking the effort to cook good food is just too much. Yeah,
it's because, I mean, I agree with you, and it's because people have, we don't care so much for ourselves. And let's say you are in a scenario where you've got kids to feed and things, right? Then you care more for the other than you do for yourself. And I think that there is this expectation as well about sacrifice. And I think, and one of the things that I'm still on this journey, right, that I'm still trying to unpack, is at what point do you actually say, I can only care for others if I care for myself? And I think that there is something in there within our religious traditions that teaches us that we should try and do both, but in the practice of living life, one tends to just sacrifice oneself for others. And if you then say, actually, this is my right, you know, or this is what I'm entitled to within a family structure, you're seen as being selfish, and you're taking away from people who've got more priority if you kind of...
Yeah, and you know, the Hebrew prophets have a lot to say about how those who have got privilege and wealth gain that on the back of and oppress those without. And there's something about that social justice element that, for me, it's a travesty that in somewhere like the UK, a mother might have to go without food herself for even a couple of days in order to feed her kids. And, you know, that people are having to use food banks in the UK. That to me is not just a political, but it's a spiritual issue. And the prophets have challenged the sort of society that's built that makes that necessary. And I think from that sort of Christian, Judeo-Christian tradition, the balance of providing and supporting food banks, but yet saying these should never actually exist. That it's a sort of tension that both have to be done, but how are we understanding our social relationships if this is where we've got?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, when I was growing up, for a period of time, we our family was supported through social security, you know, and food banks didn't exist then. And you know, I mean, I think my mum was very savvy, you know, and we kind of did okay. But if food banks didn't exist 30 or 40 years ago and things were okay, what has shifted, which has meant that food banks have to exist now? You know, and I find it horrific. I think it's obscene that we live in a society where the government has kind of absolved itself of responsibility because social organisations are coming in and kind of picking up the pieces of the mess that they've left.
Yeah, and those are deep political decisions that, of course, the answers to that are not going to come only from faith perspectives. But for those of us who have faith perspective, I think it's an indictment upon how, over many, many years, these have not been snap decisions. These are sort of accumulation of small decisions that gather momentum, and then we reach this point with people having to choose their well-being, whether they can actually buy food that's going to be good for them, or having to do something else. And that's, in all the complexity of it, it's sort of unraveled, or maybe the opposite, better way to say it's got more entangled in politics and different types of social relationships that we have. You know, I'm sure when I was young and, you know, just a kid in the tenements in Aberdeen, I wouldn't have been surprised if neighbours were helping each other out. You know, I was less than 5 years old, so I didn't know.
Yeah.
But it wasn't a huge long time after rationing had finished, and certainly the mums who were, and they would have been the mums then who were doing all the cooking, would have remembered rationing and queuing and sharing. But you know, it can't be a nostalgic answer. We're in a different place now.
Yeah, and it's interesting actually, because I think that there are, you're right in how the history has led us to this point. So another side of all of that is like looking at the kind of health provision, let's say. So for example, we now live in a world where they're saying that mental health is the or depression is now slowly becoming, or maybe already has, I can't remember my stats, apologies, but it's become one of the biggest causes of death globally, right? Overtaking obesity. Now, I haven't actually tried to unpack that and looked at the statistics in detail, but the fact that that can be said as a sentence, right? And there still is a lot of stigma over mental health issues. And then we have other things like heart disease and diabetes and obesity, which to some degree, can be responded to with a healthier lifestyle. Yet that is not supported by the NHS, because the solution for the NHS for all of these problems, whether they're physical or psychological, is here, pop a pill. And that solution, I think, the result of that over the years has now led us to the point where the NHS is no longer kind of in a position to be able to sustain itself. And yeah, it's clearly not easy, to change your diet and to try and deal with certain mental health issues through physical exercise, etc. And that's not a solution for everybody. But actually, why not try it? Why not give people the option to go down that route and then see if that works for them? Because I suspect more and more people would rather have a change in diet and do some exercise than take pills that they then have to take other pills for because of the side effects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's seeing well-being and health in the round holistically. And, to me, that's one side of my Christian perspective, is that it really does understand health in terms of not just body, not just spirit, not just mind, but also in terms of relationships with other people and the environment. It does build a broad understanding of health. But also, my Christian tradition has not been helpful in things like mental illness. And the long tradition of, right back to the Bible times, when mental illness would have been understood in demonic terms, there's spirits being expelled from people in the New Testament. There's then right through the early pre-scientific period with negative understandings of mental illness. Then you get through things like it's a punishment from God. And it's only very recently that a more positive understanding of, and sympathetic understanding from the biblical traditions and theological traditions about mental health has been emerging. And so there's a lot for my traditions to catch up on. Some great stuff being done in mental health, on spirituality and mental health and those aspects that are sort of recovering it. But, there is a legacy there that I think certainly my community has to hold their hands up and say, despite that trajectory of holistic ideas of well-being, we've certainly not always contributed positively into that.
I mean, I think what I'm going to say might be seen as being a little bit controversial, because it's something that people are a little bit scared of talking about. But I think that the world of the kind of the jinns and the spirits and all of that, it's got to exist, because God tells us it's there in the Quran and in the holy books, right? So it's got to be there. It's very scary for us to engage with it. And I think that if this is where I'm at in my head now anyway, if I believe in angels, I can't deny that other side as well. But how I then bring that into mental health is that, of course, when one faces a mental health issue, we should seek all different kind of aspects of solution, right? And so if you just if one goes down a spiritual route alone, I don't think that's satisfactory to resolve it. Just in the same way that if I was to say, just go down a kind of a medical intervention alone. But it takes courage and understanding to know that all of these different routes are available. But I also think that there's a lot of charlatans that operate within, let's say, the spiritual side of things. And that then means one has no idea who to trust. And I think that is a huge, huge issue, because then people are throwing money away. They're kind of investing a lot of time and energy, and then maybe not actually really resolving a mental health issue that then manifests itself physically. And actually the problem becomes so much worse.
Yeah, and as a practical theologian, I can sort of get off the hook, because I don't need to have a coherent, systematic worked out system of theological thinking. But to be honest, that's a bit of an escape clause, because in the Christian tradition, all that is there, spirits in the New Testament, and it's been a significant part of Christian spirituality of different flavours and currently. And I honestly don't know where I stand on this. I used to be in a particular Christian tradition that was more aware and talked the language of spirits and even a bit about angels and things. But I've then sort of moved drastically away from that. But then thinking, well, actually, that's too simplistic, too scientific an answer. How do I handle people's experience as a practical theologian if people are experiencing things that don't fit my scientific paradigm? Well, as a practical theologian, I've got to take that experience seriously. And so I'm now in this help. I don't know where I fit on this sort of stuff. Sort of maybe I'll take some of it, but maybe I'm very suspicious of it. But I want to just be rationalist. There's a bit of me that wants to be purely rationalist, but I know that's not what it means to be human.
But isn't it okay not to know the answer? Because that's kind of where I am at, and I think sometimes if we try and find the answer too much, then we just get lost inside our thoughts, and then the logic of things gets lost.
Yes, and I think having the luxury for me of not being anymore in pastoral ministry, that I can go away and think about these things. I'm not confronted with people who are requiring my pastoral intervention. And so I have a space that I appreciate isn't there for folks who are much more encountered. And it's maybe that as an academic hinders what I do, because it means I can step back a bit, but yet there's an advantage in creating that critical space to think about it. But a practical theology of spirits and ghosts and angels and demons, I've not seen somebody do that yet.
No, it'd be interesting to see, but I think it would be it would take a brave soul to go down that route, I think.
And to be sure they get a doctorate at the end of it.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's interesting when you speak about the experience, because I think kind of coming back to practical theology, if let's say somebody was to study this in practice, I can think of many different areas. So for example, let's say marriage, some people will say that their marriage is destroyed because of spirits, or some people will then talk about how someone's been possessed and their personality's changed and all of these other things. And it would be interesting to start to unpack that, because as you mentioned earlier, work has started to happen with mental health and spirituality. And I attended a conference, a good few years ago with the British Psychological Society, where some of this started to get touched upon. And there is still a lot of work to do, but I think even the fact that this has started to now be acknowledged by psychologists is going to help the people who are afflicted by some of these things. But I also kind of think sometimes, is there an element of where someone, we have this tendency where, for example, I've had the cold and the flu for ages now, and I've got this cough. So we'll go online, we'll search something, we'll read it and think, oh yeah, I've got all of these things. That must be it. And so it's one thing doing it with a cold or a knee injury or something like this. It's something completely different. It maybe actually isn't something completely different. Maybe it's the same. When someone starts to do it with a psychological issue and then starts to kind of think, actually, this is what I have. And so then those symptoms increase even more as a result of a self-diagnosis due to the internet.
Yeah, and that's a huge issue, as you say, for medical as well as psychological care. And that's where you can then get the charlatans coming in, offering easy solutions and pay them money here, there, everywhere. But the presence of charlatans shouldn't, I think, negate the importance of other perspectives. And if that's a non-rationalist, non-empirical perspective, that's where our faith traditions are keep pushing us. And for folks like me who want to be a rationalist, but no, I can't be and shouldn't be, that continual push back to those biblical texts that destabilize my nice, comfortable 21st century rationalism, I don't like it. There's a lot in the New Testament I don't like.
Well, it's interesting because, like, when you talk about rationalism, and I think that's, I like logic, so I think that's probably the route that I would take myself as well. And what I did was I thought, okay, I know this all exists, and so, for example, in Islam, some of the kind of spiritual aspects of things is called ruqya. And so ruqya is a form of medicine that you can do for yourself. And I thought, okay, let me find out about how I can study this. And it just happened that, for years and years I've been looking, nothing happened. And then there was a course last October for 3 days. And I thought, okay, I've got to do this. And I'm so pleased that I did that, because having done that and then understood it from the sources, from the text, and learning with somebody who is well respected by the scholars globally, it really helped me to then start to unpack some of these things. And so from a kind of practical aspect of well-being, and also dealing with these other kind of issues, because I think one of the things that I would like to think is that Islam views well-being holistically. So, for example, we have certain prayers to say in the morning and in the evening, or certain words to recite. And what they do is they kind of act as a protection. And so you're kind of outside the 5 prayers a day. And so you're saying these extra things. And the way that I understand it is that if you say these things, then you're protected for the day. And then if you say them at night, then you're protected in the evening. Now, my kind of perspective on this, and I'm certainly not a blind follower of faith. I need to be able to understand that what is written has a kind of a practical aspect. So I'll kind of explore it until I understand it. But actually, when I tested this, it seemed to work. And yes, I'm sure there's kind of the what do they call it when you take a blue pill and it's got no
placebo
medicine? Yeah. I'm sure there is an element of placebo, but I'm also sure that there's an element of God then saying, okay, so you've now done what I asked you to do, so you get a little bit of extra protection. And I think it's those kind of things that are daily rituals that we can do without the aid of anybody, because we've been informed that this is what you need to say, that they are practically helpful. And this is the kind of stuff that I think is missing within certain communities and certain the lives of some individuals, because what happens is that and it's not for everybody, but what happens is that some people will identify, let's say, as belonging to a particular community, but it's cultural rather than spiritual. And so when a affliction or a problem occurs, then the solution is there in front of them, but they're not actually implementing the solution. And I think actually, even in the world of practical theology, there's a lot to unpack there about where is the line between culture and practice within religion, because I think this line is kind of increasingly becoming one of cultural practice rather than religious practice. And I don't think, I personally think that we are all on a journey, but I think the awareness of that journey and kind of self-awareness of who you are and your relationship with God, that's the most important thing, right? So it's not about kind of comparing and saying, oh, look, that person's better than me and I'm better than that person. But it's about understanding where you are, and then kind of maybe coming full circle to this whole idea of well-being. If we understand who we are physically and psychologically and spiritually, maybe we can then kind of decide the areas that we need to work on to make our lives better.
And maybe just as a finishing observation, that understanding who we are is tied up with understanding who God is, because they're not totally separate. How we view ourselves is in relation to how we view God. And I think as our understanding of ourselves can change, maybe our understanding of God changes as well. Maybe that's what in practical theology we're wrestling with. How much change is possible, permitted, good, encouraged, that tension within practical theology.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a huge question, and both from an academic side, but also from a practice side. I think that's something that we'll never answer, but actually the exploration of that will give us so much rich material to then consider and to then know ourselves better, so we can know others better and know God better. Absolutely. Yeah. So
a nice positive point to finish on.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, and it's been very interesting for me, just kind of like looking at where this journey of the discussion on well-being has gone to as well, because we've touched on so many different things that I didn't expect to, and not really spoken about the things that I thought we would. So we'll save that for another episode.
Likewise. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much, Eric. It's been a fascinating discussion as always. And to the audience, thank you. Please do make sure that you subscribe and join us for another conversation in practical theology. This is Sayyyidah Zaidi saying thank you so much, and I will see you again soon.
And Eric Stoddart saying thanks for watching. Bye now.